Yeah, Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls is like one of those salient historical persons, in my opinion, not just because he directly participated in the politics of the Reconstruction era as a member of the House of Representatives, which he was elected in 1868. I'll get to that in a second. Or not just because he became a senator, but more so because of everything that went on in his life leading up to the Civil War, during the Civil War, and then, yeah, you got some notables as far as the political arena. But like one of the things that caught my attention when I first started reading about him is the year that he was born. He was born in he was born April 5th of 1839. That was only like 2 months before the James Amistad case had happened or whatnot, when he was kidnapped as a slave, and he ended up overtaking the ship with other slaves, and then trying to get the captain to sail back to Sierra Leone. But the captain ended up sailing to America. The ship got caught, etc. Blah blah blah. The case happened after that. He ended up winning his freedom. Another person that was interesting during that time period is James Covey. I spoke on this in my blog on in chapter 1. Chapter 1, Legends of Lies, the Civil War. I'm in the corner just so I could get the best audio sound because it's windy out here. But chapter 1, Legends of Lies, the Civil War, I spoke on that. I find that time period to be interesting, but I'm gonna go ahead and make this extra mention just because I forgot to mention him during that chapter. Also, Quincy Adams fought as a lawyer in that case and helped him win his freedom or whatnot as well, which got him to go back 2 years later in 1841, him and James Covey, back to Sierra Leone. But James Covey is interesting, not just because he was a translator, it's because like he only made it to America a month later in July. So that was like a big coincidence. But make a long story short, that's when Robert Smalls was born, around that time. Now, what stood out to me is where he was born at, right? Which is in South Carolina. The place is called Beaufort, South Carolina. It was pretty much a small town or whatnot. But the things that went on as when he was young as a child, it just caught my attention. It just made me think, like, okay, first off, growing up, right? Okay, because as far as like the context of South Carolina, I'll speak on it further as I go along, but I'm gonna speak a little bit on it real quick. Why I thought it was his experience growing up was interesting. Okay, South Carolina was one of the most hardcore slave states back in the day. When you're talking about threats or intentions or even attempts to secede from the Union, they tried at least 3 times. They were successful 1 time out of 3. And that, of course, was in December of 1860. The very first time they tried to secede from the Union as a state was in 1828, really, but it got solved in 1833 through the tariff compromise or whatnot. The second time is what I'm going to speak on later on as I go through this vlog. That was in 1850. The third time, like I said, was in 1860, December of that year. But they also had a very large slave population, right? Now, just a year later, in 1840, the population of slaves that they had was over 350,000. 1850, I couldn't get the census. I will explain why. It's because the revolution that was going when they were attempting to secede from the Union. In 1860, they had over 400,000 slaves. Now, the reason why I bring that up, and also keep this in mind, as far as the town that Robert Smalls was born in, Beaufort, South Carolina, they had about 32,500 plus slaves or whatnot. Now, keep that in mind. Now, There's a book that I read, and I mentioned the book also. I believe I mentioned it in chapter 1 of Legends and Lies as well. Actually, I did. And I read it the second time I was in St. Louis, Missouri. And I recall the book now. It is called Slavery in America from 1619 to 1888. And the author is a guy by the name of Peter Colkin. What I mentioned in my first chapter about Legends of Lives was that caught my attention regarding that book is when they spoke on slavery. They was talking about like in many of the southern pockets of the United States, the slave population that they would have would be quite substantial compared to other places in the United States, of course. For example, the North, etc. And the difference is like those persons or those areas that had like slaves that were not in like large numbers or whatnot. Like most of the time, they just have them like working in the house and stuff like that. You know, like doing concubine types of work, a little bit of extra shit too, but that for the most part. Everybody didn't just own farms and shit like that. A lot of that came from the South. The reason why I bring that up and I find his upbringing interesting is because first off, this guy Robert Smalls was a dark-skinned fella. In fact, he's darker than me. He's not mixed or none of that. Same thing with his mother. They didn't say anything about his father, but they have pictures of him online. He's very dark. Now, the slave master, first off, his mother, her name is Lydia Polite. Their slave master, his name was Henry McKee, Mckee. And as I'm reading about Robert Smalls, they were like, when he was growing up, they had a lot of slaves in the field as well, as far as the slave master. Because first off, Robert Smalls was born in a cabin behind the house or whatnot. But this guy, Henry McKee, took a great liking to him. So he had special privileges. Like he didn't work in the field. His mom worked in the field initially, but eventually down the line, she ended up working in the house for the most part. That was fucking notable because that's like an exception. But included in this exception is Robert Smalls working in the house because of the favor he had from the slave master. Now, his mother, she didn't like that. Not out of jealousy. She had made a great suggestion to Mr. McKee. She said, I want him to work in the fields also. I want you to put him in the fields also. And not just that, I want him to actually witness whippings. Because she didn't want him, he was being treated so good, she didn't want him to grow up in a society, especially during that time period, and have a misconception of reality. In other words, like, I guess she wanted to prepare him for when he faced the brunt of racism. That was so fucking, like, I was like, wow, in South Carolina, you know what I'm saying? Especially a place that got a decent amount of population, even within this small town in itself, and for them to be in this guy's favor, like, to me, that was different from Dred Scott, for example. Dred Scott was an older fella by the time, by the time his life is really denoted, as far as like him and his slave master, and his slave master taking him to Missouri, Michigan, and Minnesota, and then when he ended up dying, he gained his freedom or whatever, which was a part of his slave master's will. And then the wife went to court to attempt to get him back into slave property or whatnot. And then that took place, and he ended up losing the case or whatnot. But as far as the slave master that Dred Scott himself had, that guy had sons that ended up paying for his court case by the time they made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And even though they lost, they went ahead and bought his freedom. But that's different considering where Dred Scott came from, as well as the age of his age at the time. As far as Robert Smalls and his mom, Lydia Polite, that was so fucking like out of the norm. I was like, wow. But then at the same time, for her to have such a humble attitude, like you would think, like at least me in my mind, I would think like a person